You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. As always, happy to be with you. We're doing this on a Wednesday. We're doing it a little later in the week simply because there was a few things that I wanted to talk about. We'll talk about Alex Jensen's contract, which I received. We'll also talk about spring football and kind of what I observed yesterday. So let's jump into that. Before we do that, let me tell you about our sponsors, UFirst Credit Union. With your UFirst Rewards checking account, you can earn monthly reward points for buying something special for your best friend. Then you can redeem your reward points for something special for yourself. And with no monthly maintenance fees plus free ID theft protection, you can love that the UFirst Rewards checking is big on perks and peace of mind. Put your checking account to work for you so you can spend more time doing more rewarding things. It's easy rewards checking with UFirst Credit Union. Check out the full details at uFirstCU.com. All right, let's jump into this. Let's get into the Alex Jensen contract. I don't want to bog us down too much. I know people are anxious about football stuff, but this is a big deal. You've got Alex Jensen coming in, obviously, as we've talked about a billion times recently, and his contract is worth 6 years. So he's signed through March 31st, 2031. You've got a total salary, the minimum of $21.6 million, with a max including incentives of $26.1 million. Now that max, it's not likely, just simply because of all the incentives, but they're giving the opportunities there, but that could be the max. So $21.6 million over 6 years, that comes out to $3.6 million per season, with a total max per season of $4.35 million. So like I said, most years you're not going to see that $4.35 million. But it's there for the taking if things go right. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the incentives here in a second. But that $3.6 million is a pretty hefty salary for Alex Jensen. It's $1.3 million, at least $1.3 million above what Craig Smith was making his last year with the Utes. So that definitely shows an emphasis on trying to pay their guy, trying to give a look of more salary for the head coach, showing that Utah's a little bit more bought into what was in the past. So with that, it still only makes him the 8th highest paid coach in the Big 12, without knowing what Kevin Young's getting at BYU, since they're private institutions, so we don't really know there. So it's somewhere in the middle of the league, which I think is a great starting off point, right? Like, you don't want to just go at the top of the league, especially early, not knowing, if Alex Jensen can coach at the collegiate level. Obviously, there's a lot of indications that say that he can, but, it's early, and you don't want to lock yourself in too early with that. So you want to make sure that you're getting, what you need. You're making it competitive so that it shows that the University of Utah is committed to the program, that they want to be able to attract talent, whether that be coaching staff or anything else. But I think it's a good sign, right? I think for Utah fans and the Utah program in general, that's a strong indication that Utah is trying to be competitive. Now, at the same time, salaries, that's for the head coach, right? Like, it's important to know what the salary distribution will be for the assistant coaches. That helps in terms of being able to attract talent there. But at the same time, the real thing here is, what are they going to do to help promote the program, which, you're starting to see that already. But what are they going to attract in terms of NIL and the monetary amounts that they're going to be able to do to build a roster out? So I think those are the biggest things, and this contract's important. But at the same time, I don't think still most people are attracted to the coach. I mean, they are, don't get me wrong, but they're attracted at this point to the money, what kind of opportunities there, what is, the investment in the program. And so I think this is just the first sign of many that we're going to see. Now, with the first hire that Alex Jensen made in the, as an assistant coach, that obviously shows an interest in being able to be more invested. And I'll get to kind of another move that that is on the radar. But just breaking down this salary just real quickly, like I said, I don't want to bog down, but his base salary will be $300,000 a year. Appearance fees are $2.5 million. So these are like those appearance fees, the speaking fees. This is basically everything that a coach does in terms of public and media and everything. These are the salaries that he's getting as part of that. The outfitter fee, which is Under Armour right now, he gets $400,000. These are things where he can sign his own deal up to $400,000. And if he's not able to get that, then the university will make up the difference to $400,000. Similar with a multimedia rights deal, which is up to $400,000. So you've got that. And then, as I mentioned, the incentives, which go up to $750,000. So most years, I would say, are probably not going to get there. But, some of those incentives, the top end incentives are if the Utes win a national championship, he'll make $200,000. If they make a Final Four appearance, he'll add $100,000 to that. If they're Big 12 regular season champs, he'll add $100,000 to it. And then there's different varying degrees, whether from $25,000 to $50,000 or whatever it may be, based on other factors, being the coach of the year in the conference or winning a first tournament game in the NCAA tournament, or even just getting to the NCAA tournament. He'll get different benefits from that. And these are standard for most coaches. In football, it's generally about conference championships, bowl games. There's still academic stuff. So the APR, a high APR is going to get you more money in terms of being a coach. So there's still an incentive at the university to try to get good grades. And that's tied to a coach's salary. But at the end of the day, those aren't massive, right? So, football has definitely put an emphasis on trying to have great APR, but we'll see. I don't expect Alex Jensen to be any different, but some of those incentives aren't necessarily as much as what they could be, but still, an extra $50,000 in your pocket or $25,000 in your pocket, those are always good. So, like I said, the base that he's going to make every single season is $3.6 million, which is pretty solid. There is a bit of a transition period for Alex Jensen simply because he is with the Dallas Mavericks right now. Because he's kind of splitting his time, the university has written into his contract that he doesn't have to work more than 10 hours a week while he's with the Mavericks. As part of that, he will only make 25% of his salary, and those are just the base and appearance fees. So he'll make 25% of that until he, finishes his time in Dallas and comes to Utah. And they do have a set end date of June 30th if for whatever reason things continue to move forward with the Mavericks. But that's definitely far out there, and I would assume that he's here with Utah before then. So a lot of different things going on with that. Obviously this is a good sign for Utah in terms of their commitment, as I've mentioned. And so I think, there's nothing too earth-shattering here. It's more just kind of the monetary factor that goes into this and kind of what they're willing to pay. So, like I said, it's a first step of many for Utah trying to rebound. They've got to be able to pay competitive wages for their coaches. Obviously, you have to put in an investment into the program, and you've got to be able to, attract donors and NIL and all that kind of stuff. Now, one factor that we still don't know about this is how that house settlement distribution is going to go. You may remember I talked about this a few weeks ago, and if you don't, you can go back and listen to the episode of how it's broken down. But there's going to be, up to $21.5 million that universities can allocate to giving to the athletes, right? So they're paying athletes this money for, just being a student athlete there. Now, as part of that, the university gets to decide how they're going to distribute that. So, football is obviously going to take a bulk of that simply because it's the most money-making, arm of the athletic department. You're going to give a majority of that money to them, right? Now, granted, that money may not be that much more than what a basketball player makes simply because there's, 85 to 105 football players as opposed to, 15 or so for basketball. So it's not like it's earth-shattering money, but at the same time, when you distribute $21.5 million to your athletic department and give the bulk of it to football and basketball, men's basketball specifically, that adds to it. So we still don't know those numbers. We're still waiting on kind of how the university is going to distribute that kind of stuff. I've heard numbers, and this is just all speculation, so don't take it as gospel truth. But, somewhere around 85% of that money will be devoted to football, with something like 10 to 15% being given. I mean, it has to be a little less than 15% simply because you've got other programs. But, let's just say 10% for the men's basketball team, and the remaining goes to other programs. So the other programs, that sounds like the women aren't getting anything. There was that huge donation made to the university that will help contribute to that. So that's where that's coming from. It's specifically, kind of earmarked for women's athletics. And so obviously gymnastics is going to get a bulk of that. You're going to get women's basketball, softball, volleyball, those kinds of things. That's going to be kind of earmarked for that kind of stuff. So this money can kind of be moved that way. So like I said, this is where things are starting. We still want to know kind of the ballpark figures of NIL, and we won't know that fully at this time. We've heard different things about it, doubling, maybe tripling what Utah had this last year, which was about $2 million. Honestly, you to be a competitive team, you need to be closer to that triple, right? You need to be about $6 million in NIL to be able to compete. There's been rumors about BYU being somewhere around $15 million to $17 million for this next year, which doesn't come as a surprise given the numbers that were given to AJ Diabansa, which is somewhere around $7 million with all of his deals. So one player is going to attract that much money. You have to imagine there's going to be more money for other players that they're going to bring in. So it's an arms race, right? And until the market kind of settles and fixes itself, or different things happen from the NCAA's perspective to kind of limit some of that stuff, this is where it's going to be. And so for Utah to compete, they at least have to make a good mark at a jumping off point, right? That's not to say that they need to compete at the highest level with the Dukes, the Kentuckys, even in the Big 12, the Kansas or the Arizonas or different things that way, but they've got to at least be close, or closer than what they were, right? Like Utah was near the bottom, if not the bottom, with their NIL funds. And so you've got to be able to move forward with that and grow. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to definitely get, what's going to be beneficial for the program and kind of how this is going to go. And I think the biggest move here is kind of the one that hasn't been made official yet. Pete Thamel from ESPN yesterday tweeted out that Wes Wilcox, he's the assistant GM for the Sacramento Kings, is going to be taking the general manager job at Utah. That, like I said, it hasn't become official yet. Everything is pointing to that being the case, and Pete Thamel's not necessarily going to, stick that out there if it's not true. So there's a lot of interest there simply because of kind of his connection with Alex Jensen when they worked in the G League together. He's obviously, a high-ranking official in the Sacramento Kings in an NBA organization. Pete Thamel said that he's the highest-ranking sitting NBA front office member to take a college position, when this becomes final. And so this shows a level of attention to this, new era of college basketball that Utah's trying to attract, right? They're coming in there, they're bringing in a guy previously with Rafael Chilius who, has got a lot of great recruiting ties, has a lot of, cachet in the collegiate world in terms of who he's been able to bring on in terms of talent. He's been able to get 17 guys to the NBA. He's been a recruiter that has evaluated this kind of talent, has been able to do it. So you mix that, who he's going to be your key, recruiter, and now you've got your general manager who is also in the NBA level, who is a high-ranking official, who has evaluated talent for the Cleveland Cavaliers in the past. You can kind of see how that's worked out for Cleveland as of late. They're clearly one of the best teams in the NBA, and has developed, some phenomenal chemistry together and done well. It's not all on Wes Wilcox, but, he was a guy that was scouting and developing a lot of that talent in the early days before moving with Sacramento. So, it's another move to kind of show what Utah's doing in terms of their investment in the program, right? All of these things, they mean nothing necessarily until it all kind of shows out on the court, right? Like until you can bring in the talent, you can win at a high level. All of these are just names, right? So even with Alex Jensen, yes, he is a former great at the University of Utah, but until all of this changes and there's production on the court, it's just another roster, right? And so we'll see. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of reasons for Utah fans to be optimistic here. There's a huge emphasis in being able to make Utah basketball great again, trying to be able to get this in a competitive landscape where Utah can compete. And as you saw this last year, Utah, for the most part, had some competitive games, right? Obviously, we've talked about how they had their struggles and they would lose some of these other games, but they're a team that was able to compete. Now, if you can continue to do that and build upon it, Utah's close. I still will say that as much as the NCAA tournament is kind of your goal, I think the pieces around what Utah has had make it tough to make that the immediate goal for year one. Now, there's nothing to say that they can't. I think you see in basketball, money can influence the game so much more than football, right? You pay a couple guys in football, and yeah, you're paying for a quarterback, you're paying for a wide receiver, or whatever that may be, but it doesn't influence the entire game. You still have offense, you still have defense that you have to compete with. This in basketball, you can make a much quicker turnaround, right? And so if you can pay the right guys and bring in the right guys that are going to come into the system and work the system that Alex Jensen wants to run, which, as I've said, is more of an NBA style system, and being able to have some tempo and being able to play free and all kinds of stuff that way that we've talked about, things can change, right? Like you saw a team like Drake bring in Division II players and come together, and they made it to the NCAA tournament. Now, granted, their path is a little different. I would argue harder and easier at the same time than what Utah has. But at the same time, you can change things, right? Like if you can get guys bought in and you can get, the right talent level and you can get the guys that he wants to use, this becomes a great opportunity for Utah. So, we'll see. There's still going to be a lot here. We're still going to get some more coaching. We're still going to get some transfer portal stuff. Recently, more players have entered the transfer portal. Miro Little was the latest one to enter the portal. But as has been mentioned, a majority of these guys were going to enter the portal regardless. That's not to say that they can't go. But I do know that there's still a lot of interest for some of these players to come back. I've talked about Keanu Dawes, Jake Wallin, Ezra Assar, Mike Sharvjomps. He's still on the team, and so there's nothing to indicate that he has left yet. And we'll see how these continue to go. But at the same time, there's still going to be some emphasis in trying to keep some of these guys. And if you can keep, a few of these core guys here who understand the Utah system in terms of just what it takes to be at Utah and kind of the culture and all that kind of stuff, that adds to it, right? Now you add those pieces to whatever they're going to get through the transfer portal and recruiting and that kind of stuff, then it becomes, a much easier to kind of figure out what this team is going to be. So we'll see what happens. But that's it for basketball today. I want to move on to football. Yesterday, so Tuesday, was the first day we got the opportunity to actually watch football. This was a great 20-minute period. Sometimes in the past when we've, as media, has gotten to watch scrimmage, sometimes it's been the punt team or special teams doing different things that way. This was definitely a great situation to be able to watch with 11 on 11, the first day of pads. So there's going to be a little bit more juice as guys are trying to show out and trying to show what they can do with their pads. And it was a lively day, honestly. Like the second you got in there, there was a lot of screaming and a lot of yelling in a good way, right? Like a lot of guys that are just fired up, trying to get to where they needed to go. Coaches are coaching them hard. It felt like a fall practice. It definitely did not feel like a spring practice in terms of kind of the intensity and the effort and just trying to get the most out of these guys. You've got these new coaches like a Mark Ituaya. He's in there. He's fired up. He's loud. He's coaching his players hard. He's not giving them any ease being there. A guy like Wayshawn Parker, who is expected to be the number one running back for the team, Atuaya, who obviously has coached him before, he's riding him hard, right? Like he's getting into him and trying to make sure that he understands what he needs to do and trying to help him as, not just him, but everybody else. And so you're seeing a team that is really fired up and motivated to be able to get better, right? And so what that means, it doesn't necessarily foretell anything in terms of the fall, but I think you're seeing a team that really is frustrated with the last few years. They're also energized with what they've got, and you're seeing kind of an early jumping off point of how this team can be successful. You've got, obviously, Jason Beck comes in as the new offensive coordinator. He's got his guy at quarterback in Devin Dampier. He's got some other complementary players there and some other people that know his system. But this is an opportunity where Utah, even though they've rebuilt their entire offense, they have kind of a jumping off point where they have the familiarity with your head guy in being the offensive coordinator and your head player in being Devin Dampier, where they can kind of just run. The rest of that stuff, obviously the players have to learn kind of his playbook and understand all that. But at the end of the day, playbooks in college football or in the NFL or whatever level, they're relatively the same, right? Like they're not necessarily this crazy thing, or at least they're not generally meant to be. With Andy Ludwig, they got to be a little crazy. But for the most part, the players have a basic understanding of what they need to do, right? So now it's this, especially in spring, is really exposing them to everything. At least at a high level effort, they'll get more into the offensive install in the off season and getting into fall camp. But this is getting in there and just really looking at the nitty gritty of everything. What can we do? What can we be capable of? Obviously, guys are going to be a little bit more raw because they haven't been exposed to some of this stuff in terms of Utah's system and that kind of stuff. And so, I can't talk about full specifics. That's part of the rules of being able to watch this for the media. But I'll say that, in these 11-on-11 drills, where they're simulating game time situations, this was an offense that was very diverse, right? In terms of play calling, in terms of, the talent being thrown out onto the field. And granted, I wouldn't read too much into either one of those simply because, like I said, they're trying to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, trying to see who is capable, what guys are going to be in the mix. But I think it is a true kind of look in at what Utah's going to do on offense. This isn't going to be a system where, it's just going to be, you run the same play 4 times and hope that you can have some success. You're going to have some different things, some different wrinkles that are going to make it so that, this play, you saw it last time, but now we're going to run it with this wrinkle, right? And this guy is going to motion out in the back, or you're going to have this player that's now involved in the game that changes. And so I was most impressed with just simply the ability to be able to change a bunch of different things. There was a bunch of different looks. There was one play specifically where it was a red zone play. Devin Dampier was throwing it in the back of the end zone to Landon King. It was the throw and the route hadn't kind of met fully, and so Landon wasn't able to bring it down the way that he needed to. But what was most encouraging is you had 2 crossing routes in a similar area that allowed Devin Dampier to not have to look off to a million different areas, right? He had 3 guys essentially in the same area that he could have thrown to, and I would argue that the first 2, the ones in front of the end zone a little bit, were probably, they were open as well. I would, their routes weren't run as crisply at that time, but it showed to me that they're trying to make an emphasis on trying to just be able to have multiple areas where this can be. Whereas we saw last year, there were so many things, and granted, this was also the nature of having a true freshman quarterback where you kind of have to simplify things. There were so many situations where Utah didn't have multiple reads, right? It was just simply, okay, you have to go here. You saw that with the Caleb Lohner touchdowns. You throw here, you can look off another way, but there really wasn't much there. There was either trying to be pass protection, there was trying to be something else. You try to get Brant Keithy in there, but he had to pass protect and then eventually, roll out into the flats. But those didn't develop fast enough because Utah was getting blown up, and there just wasn't a lot of dynamicism. I can't even remember how that word said. Dynamic. It wasn't dynamic. We'll say that. Right? And so I think you're seeing in this play calling a lot of different looks and a lot of different things that allow Devin Dampier to work. Most impressive as part of all this, though, is how well the offensive line was holding firm, right? There were definitely several plays where Devin Dampier had all day to throw it. Now, with that said, he's not holding onto the ball for a ton of time, right? He's he's quick. He's able to get the ball out. He sees his read, and he's generally able to deliver it. There's a few errant passes, right? There's still things in terms of his passing game that needs to improve. And, there was one play yesterday, and it's just one play, but it definitely was not a right read, right? It got blown up pretty quickly. It happens, right? But at the same time, he had far more success in the run game as well as the passing game, and being able to have an offensive line that he has. And that offensive line held firm. They did very well in terms of being able to give him the protection that he needs. Look, they're not tackling Dampier, in this, but there was very few interactions where Dampier would even be, under fire, right? There was a few, but at the same time, this was far and away different than what we saw last year. To that point, Isaac Wilson, he was getting the number 2 reps yesterday. There's been a lot of talk of potentially redshirting him this year, but as of now, it seems like he's still the number 2 guy. So I don't know what that will mean moving forward, if it shows kind of his level of progression or whatever that may mean, but he was throwing it out at a much quicker rate too. There wasn't a lot of holding on to the ball. Now, granted, game-like scenarios versus spring practice or even just practice in general are different, right? Isaac is always great in practice. I wouldn't say always great, but because he's a freshman, there was a lot of things that he did in practice that didn't necessarily always translate to the real field, right? And that happens for freshmen, sophomores. A lot of these guys that are early into it, the speed of the game gets quicker. Things mean more, and so you start putting more pressure on yourself. But if this is kind of the trajectory with him, you're starting to see him throw the ball much quicker. He's getting it at, that release is much faster. He's snapping the ball. He's seeing his read quickly. He's delivering it, and it's paid off. He did throw an interception yesterday in part of the period that we watched, but that's not to say that was a bad situation. This is an opportunity for him to continue to grow and show that progress. And if he really is the number 2 guy, this is where I think Utah needs to see that level of progression, right? Can he get the release out? Can he make the reads that he needs to make in a quicker manner? Those are those things that true freshmen really struggle with. If you remember, and if you've listened to this podcast a lot, there was an episode I did in the fall, October, November, somewhere around there, where I kind of showed that if you give a freshman just 1 year, they can completely change their level of performance the next year. Meaning, if you put a true freshman out there, a majority of the true freshmen out there, almost all of the true freshmen out there, struggle to a high level. Some of them do a little bit better than others, but they struggle at a high level. Now, if you even just give them that redshirt year, and so they come in and start as a redshirt freshman, that is a completely different game for them. They've got a 1-year system under their belts. They understand it better. Does that mean they're perfect? No. They're not going to be the junior, senior, the veteran quarterbacks out there, but there's a far difference in just giving a freshman quarterback a year. That's where I want to see with Isaac Wilson, right? We have to assume that, Devin Dampier, may get hurt at one point, or there may be a series or something. Obviously Utah fans don't want to hear that, and somebody's knocking on wood somewhere. But you've got to have these backup quarterbacks ready. And if you really believe that Isaac Wilson is somewhat of a future quarterback for Utah, this is the year that he has to make that stride, right? Because moving forward, you've got other quarterbacks that have been brought in as freshmen. You've got already lining up other guys. Your 2026 guy or 27. Guy is already committed in Thaddeus Thatcher. You're building that roster out, right? And so it becomes a limited timeline where if Isaac Wilson can't make that progress, make that jump in this next year, there's a real possibility that you get overlooked because there's other players that are coming in. Now, with that being said, I don't think there's anybody on the roster that challenges him immediately. I think there's guys that will compete and do well, but he is, at this point, probably solidified as your backup. And I think simply with how Kyle Whittingham has talked about him in terms of him doing well early on, shows that, there's a level of progress there, right? Kyle's not one to throw names around unless there's something there. And so it would be real easy for him just to say, talk about Devin Dampier and kind of what he's done and not even mention Isaac or any other quarterbacks. And so we'll see what happens there. I went a little too far getting down that Isaac Wilson route, but I think this is kind of the spring for him where he can kind of showcase his talent, really kind of hone in on who he can be as a quarterback. if he can get that quicker release time and he can get those reads out faster, I think you're going to see a much more confident quarterback room, knowing that obviously Devin Dampier is your guy. He's a guy that comes in there and can run everything. But if he goes down for whatever reason, you do have a competent guy that is in there. Now, granted, you also have Nate Johnson in that room, who you have experience with. He understands quarterback conceptually. With that being said, Nate Johnson is going to be a Swiss Army knife guy. Kyle Whittingham said it yesterday. He is going to be the guy that is just everything. He could be quarterback. He could be a wide receiver. He could be a running back. You can put him in all kinds of situations, and Utah is fully committed to making that happen. This wasn't one of those things where it was a few years ago when he was here the first time where it was just some gimmick stuff, right? This is something where they truly want, there's some gimmick stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but this is something where they want to make him a regular part of the roster that allows him to be able to do everything. And so the more you can mix and match that, that's going to help Utah be able to kind of keep him utilized in a way that doesn't kind of key in on certain things. You knew last year that when a certain player was going to go in, it was going to be the wheel route. You knew that when this player was going to go in, it was going to be, for third and long situations, and you had to be able to get some extra yards, those kinds of things. This is where Utah has to not have that tell where they said, okay, Nate Johnson's in, we're going to put him, we're going to play it this way. You've got to mix and match that. And I think he's committed to that. I think Utah has fully developed a plan for him where they can do that. Yesterday he probably made the highlight of the day in terms of what he was able to do. Once again, can't talk about the full play, but essentially he, broke some tackles from the defensive line and immediately had green grass in front of him for a touchdown. And it was, a thing of beauty where the entire defense they just didn't see it coming, quite honestly. And so this is a great opportunity for Utah if they can maximize that potential. And Nate Johnson 100% will be a part of that. You could call him the Britton Covey. I don't think that's necessarily the same role. Britton Covey was much more, I don't know. We'll see. I know everybody wants to have the next Britton Covey, right? And I get that. When you have a guy like that who is so talented and it was just a playmaker for Utah, you want to replicate that. But I don't know that these two are going to be the exact same type of player, right? I think they're going to be different. But at the same vein, you do have two guys that were quarterbacks. They understand things at a different level that, guys that have only played wide receiver or only have played running back understand things, right? They understand different things, from a scheme standpoint, how the teams are going to, compete against them, that kind of stuff. I think that helps them in just being able to be out there. Plus, he's shifty. He knows what he's doing. He's a great asset out there, and I think you're going to see a lot of him. So just getting back to Devin Dampier just a little bit. First impressions of him, he commands that offense, right? It's not one of those things where, he's out there and he's still being timid or guys don't trust him. Everybody there seems fully committed to him. And the players that we talked to yesterday, they kind of get a smile, similar to how the early days of Cam Rising, where the players get a smile about how excited they are with him. That's kind of the vibe that I'm getting with Devin Dampier, where he's just kind of this guy that exudes confidence, right? He's also a really personable guy. He wants to come in there and just kind of be the friend of everybody. He's talking to the defense. He's talking to the offense. He's talking to the special teams. He's making everybody included in the team and not just focusing on his guys. That was very similar to what Cam Rising did. And that's why he won the locker room early on, is because he was a guy that genuinely cared about everyone on that team. That's what Devin Dampier can be. Now, that goes a long ways, obviously, and that they've put him on the leadership council because the players trust him. And you can argue, oh, well, he's a quarterback, all quarterbacks going. It's not true. This is a guy that's come in here and immediately, inserted himself into this leadership role. He's got a lot of that respect from his players, and that's going to go a long way, especially in terms of team chemistry as they go into the offseason. He's a guy that 100% will be out there, organizing practices as players, trying to get guys to come in, trying to get throws, trying to make sure that he has that timing with his receivers, with his offensive line. He's a guy that's going to take his offensive line to lunch periodically. He's with them, meeting with them weekly, trying to make sure that they're good. This is a guy that is fully committed to the game of football. I'm really fascinated to kind of see how he gels with this team. Like I said, it was a lively, fiery period yesterday, and he was able to make a lot of plays. Now, with that said, yes, he is a shorter quarterback, right? And you've got an offensive line that is very tall and a challenge that way. But there wasn't anything from his game, at least from the spring portion that we watched. And look, it's one spring portion that I felt his height limited him, right? Obviously, you would want a taller quarterback, and I think that's what one of the biggest knocks on him has been early on in his career. But he's finding ways to be able to make it happen. And there's that one errant throw that I talked about. Maybe that was inhibited by the height of the offensive line. But for the most part, he's finding ways to be able to make it work. He sees his reads. He understands it. He's instinctual. He can get there. And at the very least, if everything breaks down, he's got phenomenal legs that can, move out and do what he needs to. So this is a guy that Utah has a ton of trust in. They feel really excited about what he is. There's no question that he's the starter, right? Like, you bring a guy in like this simply because he understands Beck's system. And, he didn't shy away from saying he came to Utah, a majority of it because of Coach Beck. And so I think the chemistry that those two have together, that they can build together continually, shows where Utah can go. And it shows that they can continue to be at a higher level than if they had just brought in a new offensive coordinator and a new quarterback to the system. This is a guy that, they're new, but at the same time, they've had a year of experience together and understand how they work. And the fact that they were able to become the number 4 offense in the country last year at New Mexico kind of shows that there's some potential there. So, really, really fascinated by that. You also got a first look at Wayshawn Parker. The guy, he has a different style of running that feels much more grounded, right? There's a lot of plays where he just he exudes that confidence as well, right? And he talks that way, right? He's a very well-spoken kid who is very confident in his abilities and what he's able to do out there. There's obviously things that he needs to improve on. He was a freshman, right? Like, there's things that he needs to grow, but he wants to become that 1,000-yard rusher, right? He wants to be able to be in there and make an impact on the game. There's still some conditioning that he feels like he needs to do and get in there now that he has pads on. But he has full trust as well in Devin Dampier and talking to him and kind of the confidence that the two can have back in that field. The two played against each other last year while he was at Washington State and Devin Dampier was at New Mexico. He talked about how phenomenal of a player Dampier was and how they just destroyed New Mexico. This is, They understand each other at a high level. They've worked well together. They have some good chemistry. And Parker sees it as an opportunity and not a threat to have Dampier with the running ability, right? It opens up the game for Parker simply because you don't know where it's going to come. Now you throw in a guy like Nate Johnson in there as well. You could have a 2-back set where you have Parker and Johnson in there, and then you have Devin Dampier. You could, at any moment, literally run a triple option. And it could work really well. You could have, guys that could flex out and run in different ways. You could have guys that can, hit the A gap, B gap, whatever you want to do. I mean, there's a lot of variability that you can have with those 3 guys specifically. There's going to be more playmakers, right? But I think that's to the level of what Utah's trying to do is they want to create a system where you're completely guessing what they're going to do. And as long as Utah doesn't have too many tells or, they're not mixing up their signals well enough and teams are able to scout those well, this is a team that they feel very comfortable being able to be dynamic and saying, okay, look, we gave you this look. We had 2 wide receivers flexed out and they gave it this time, but now we're going to switch it up and we're going to do this. I think that's where Beck really finds enjoyment in what he does, and he has the talent to be able to do it. Now, as part of this, there's going to be some positions that there's still some unknowns, right? On the offensive side, it's still wide receiver. You still want to see the guy that is going to step up. Dadrian Zipperer had a good day yesterday from what I could tell. He caught a lot of passes. Ryan Davis had some good catches. There's some other guys that were doing some good things, creating some separation, and Dampier or Wilson, for that matter, were able to deliver the ball at the right time and make some plays. So that's going to be kind of the biggest area on the offensive side of the ball is to understanding who's going to be there. You've got Zach Williams, who was coming on strong at the end of the season. You got Dadrian Zipperer, who obviously is similarly. You've got Otto Tia, who played well at Utah State and can be a factor in there. Ryan Davis, like I said. You've got a lot of these other guys in there. And then you also have Hunter Andrews, who is in there as a tight end. And this one is really fascinating to me simply because you can utilize him in a lot of different ways that are probably more similar to Brant Keithy than anybody else, right? He can come in there and be utilized as a multi-talented player who obviously was slated as a running back last year before moving to linebacker, before moving to running back, to more linebacker, now to tight end. This is a guy that has some versatility, and Utah's going to do whatever they can to try to expose that. Not expose it in a bad way, but expose it to the world in terms of, his talent. So I think, however he's utilized, whether it be in the receiving game, the running game, whatever it may be, I think Utah has found a way to be able to be pretty dynamic in what they do. So, a lot of questions still to be had. We're really fascinated to see how this wide receiver group comes together and how that complements a lot of what Utah is going to do. But I think that's going to be a real fascinating situation. In the running back room, Kyle Whittingham, he wasn't quite as definitive on Wayshawn Parker as I would expect. That's not to say that he's not the guy, right? Like there's no question that he's the guy. Kyle decided to say, Parker has the inside track. And I think maybe that's him pushing him. Maybe that's him just trying to say, like, look, he's the guy. Kyle gets a little bit more covert, we'll say, with some of these things in terms of how he talks about his running backs. But I think he wants to see more from Parker. And that's not a bad thing. I think he's trying to get a higher level from him and being able to get the most out of him. And I think with Whittingham kind of putting that pressure on him, as well as Mark Atuaya, who understands how he plays and understands what he does, I think that shows kind of their level of commitment to him. Once again, he was a freshman last year, and yes, he performed at a high level, and obviously he was one of the top running backs in the country in the transfer portal, and so it was a big get for Utah. But look, you can't just sit on your laurels, right? Like, you've got to be able to move forward and progress and grow. So I think this is what they're doing to push him. I don't have any doubt that he's going to be the guy. Whether he is the only guy remains to be seen. Only guy meaning the bell cow back, right? Like, there's other guys that are going to factor in there. But I don't know if it's going to be a situation where they continue to throw in some other guys. Bray got in there and had some really phenomenal runs. He's a guy that's going to kind of showcase his talent early. At least he did in the first practice. So there's other guys in there that can have some talent and do some things. But I still think Wayshawn is your guy. He runs with some force, but at the same time, he's very patient. He doesn't get knocked off his blocks too much, and he gets in there and he is able to just kind of attack the holes really well with some good balance, right? I think you've seen over the last few years a couple of the guys that have come in there, they kind of get knocked back a bit and they're not able to fight through that. One of the things that people loved about Zach Moss is he could fight through that. He could get through, contact and continue to push for the yards after carries, that kind of stuff. That's the type of a player to some extent that Wayshawn Parker is. He's very balanced in what he does. And I think you're going to see a difference in kind of how he runs as opposed to maybe what we've seen in the last few years. So really curious to see what's there. I don't think he's in any risk of losing his job unless he gets, cocky and thinks that he's the only guy, which I don't believe. I think he's committed to working. But I think you see a coaching staff that is 100% committed to pushing him. And I think that's a good thing. So there's that. And then lastly, the other position of competition, at least the highest level of competition, we'll say, is the corner spot. And that's the opposite side of Scooby Davis. Kyle felt pretty confident in Scooby Davis in locking up one of those positions. And so it's trying to find another guy that's going to be there. Now, some of that can be Smith Snowden. He was playing at times in nickel yesterday. He's playing on the outside sometimes, which is not a surprise. He's played nickel, obviously, last year. There are moments that he played on the outside, and there's a lot of conversation about him wanting to play on the outside more. Regardless, there's an emphasis in wanting to utilize him in whatever ways that they can, whether that's the outside or in nickel and trying to be able to go up against some of those bigger guys or whatever. There's an emphasis in who he is, and there's no question that he's kind of that standout corner / nickel, right? And so curious to see how they develop that, but I think they're really wanting to have somebody else be opposite of Scooby Davis, trying to get in there. Still don't know kind of what that's going to be there. Bryce Cotton yesterday had a good showing. That's kind of a good indication in terms of who I think maybe could be in that mix. But it's still TBD. We'll get more practices and kind of see what's going on there. By the end of spring camp, we generally hear a lot of good names, right? Like Sharif Shah is really committed to developing these guys, and we generally get a good idea of who those guys are going to be by the end of spring. But I think it's still too early. And there's going to be some other guys that they need to develop, right? They've lost some through the transfer portal already. It happens, for whatever reason. And I still haven't heard all the reasons about it, to be honest. You have guys that are leaving and transferring already. So, really curious to see what goes on there. But I think this is a team that feels pretty confident in itself. That's not to say that everything is perfect or that Utah is suddenly at a high level. But I think where Utah needs to be at right now, it's, like I said, a very energetic, it's very lively, it's very competitive. They feel like they've got a lot of diversity in kind of what they're able to do, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, there's obviously going to be things in terms of figuring out who are your guys at defensive end or at in the defensive line positions or whatever that may be, the interior guys. There's a lot of questions still to be had, and a lot of things to be able to be learned. We're not going to learn them all in spring, but I think we're getting kind of a clearer picture of some aspects of it and kind of what Utah wants to do. So really fascinated by that, really looking forward to seeing more of this. We'll get practices every Tuesday and Thursday, and I'll try to do my best to kind of give you some updates that way as best as I can. As I said, I can't talk about things fully. If Kyle Whittingham talks about it in something, we can talk about it a little bit more, especially if it's scheme or how a player is being used. But I think, we can give you enough that kind of gives you an understanding of what's going on. But I think it's an exciting time for Utah fans to be able to watch football. I understand, fans don't want to get their hearts broken and kind of feel like they're giving themselves up to hope. But I think, right now you can start investing in it. I think there's a lot of good things happening, a lot of excitement to be had. So we'll call that a day. We'll get back at this again next week, talk about some more things. I'm sure we'll get some more Alex Jensen news in terms of more assistant coaches being hired, maybe some players that are committed. The men's basketball team also still has their tournament starting next week, so we'll see how that goes and kind of what's shaping up that way. But with that said, I hope you have a great week, and we will chat with you later.